They called her unsinkable. Not as a joke or marketing slogan whispered in back rooms, but as a public claim. White Star Line and the newspapers of the time treated the Titanic as something close to invincible. 16 watertight compartments, advanced design, the largest moving object ever built by human hands at that moment, yet even before she left Southampton, strange things followed her. A coal fire burned deep in one of her bunkers for days. Crew members knew about it. They tried to control it by shifting coal and fighting the heat. Some later claimed the fire weakened a section of the hull. Whether that is fully true or not, the fire was real, and it was never fully extinguished before the ship sailed. On the day of departure, the Titanic almost collided with another ship in the harbor. The near miss was close enough that people on the dock held their breath. A few days later, while crossing the Atlantic, she received multiple iceberg warnings from other vessels. The messages arrived. Some were delivered, others were delayed, ignored, or treated as routine. The ship continued at speed through the dark. History likes clean stories. The Titanic's story was never clean. Iceberg messages came in all day on April 14. Ships ahead of the Titanic reported ice fields. One message from the SS Californian was especially clear. The operator on the Titanic was busy sending passenger telegrams and told the other ship in essence to stop interrupting. The Californian's operator shut down for the night not long after. That single decision mattered. The Californian was the closest ship. When the Titanic later fired distress rockets, crew members on the Californian saw them. They discussed what the lights might mean. They did not wake their captain with urgency. They did not steam toward the rockets at full speed. The gap between the two ships remained open, while more than 1,500 people entered the water. Meanwhile, the Titanic's own lookouts had no binoculars. The key to the locker where the binoculars were kept had been left behind in Southampton. In the darkness, eyes alone were not enough. When the iceberg finally appeared, it was already too close. The ship turned. The sides scraped. The damage looked small from the deck. Below the waterline it was fatal. 14 years before the Titanic sailed, a novel called Futility described a massive ocean liner named the Titan. It was said to be unsinkable. It hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic in April. There were not enough lifeboats. Most of the passengers died in the cold water. The parallels are so sharp that people still argue about coincidence versus something darker. Other strange details piled up. A passenger named Mrs. Hart later claimed she had felt a strong sense of doom and almost refused to board. Another man canceled his trip after a disturbing dream. On board, the richest man in the world, John Jacob Astor, was traveling with his young wife. Millionaires, immigrants and crew shared the same fate once the water rose. Even the ship's name carried weight. Titanic. Named for the titans of myth, beings of immense power who were eventually overthrown. The language of the time treated the ship as a triumph of human will over nature. Nature answered differently. When the iceberg struck at 11:40 p.m., many passengers felt only a slight jolt. Some went back to bed. Others walked the decks, curious but calm. The band assembled and played to keep people steady. Lifeboats began to lower, but the process was slow and uneven. First-class passengers filled many of the early boats. Third-class passengers faced locked gates and confusion in the lower decks. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, quickly understood the truth. The damage had opened too many compartments. The Titanic would sink. He spent his final hours helping others and making no attempt to save himself. Captain Edward Smith gave orders, then disappeared into the final chaos. Wireless operators stayed at their posts sending distress calls until the power failed. One of the last messages simply said the ship was sinking by the head. As the stern rose higher, people clung to railings. The lights stayed on longer than many expected. Then the ship broke. The front section plunged. The rear stood nearly vertical before sliding under. In the water, the cold did most of the killing. Those who made it into lifeboats watched the largest ship in the world vanish in under 3 hours. More than 2,500 people died. The survivors carried stories that did not always match. Some spoke of calm. Others described panic and the terrible sound of people in the water. Investigations followed. Safety rules changed. Lifeboat requirements increased. The world learned, at terrible cost, that unsinkable was a word that should never have been used, yet mysteries lingered. How much did the coal fire matter? Why were certain warnings treated so lightly? Why did the nearest ship not respond faster? The wreck itself, found decades later on the ocean floor, confirmed the break and the speed of the sinking, but it could not answer every human question. The Titanic's history is stranger than the simple tale of an iceberg and a dark night. It is a story of confidence that became arrogance, of warnings that arrived too late or went unheard, of coincidences that feel scripted, and of ordinary people forced into extraordinary final hours. The ship is gone. The questions it left behind are not. That is the Titanic you were not always told about. The one that still refuses to rest quietly in the past. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats. That number was legal at the time, based on the ship's tonnage, rather than the number of people on board. More than 2,200 passengers and crew shared space, designed for roughly 1,178 in the boats. When the order came to lower them, confusion ruled the decks. Some boats left half empty because officers feared the davits could not handle full weight. Others waited too long. Third-class passengers struggled through locked gates and crowded corridors, while first-class boats pulled away. Women and children first was the rule, yet many men from wealthier cabins still found seats. And many women from lower decks never reached the rail. The cold water waited for those left behind. As the ship tilted and the decks grew steeper, the ship's musicians gathered on the sloping boat deck. They played cheerful tunes at first, then hymns. Survivors later disagreed on the final song, but almost everyone agreed on one fact: the band kept playing until the end. Wallace Hartley and his 7 fellow musicians stayed at their posts while water climbed around them. None of them survived. Their decision became one of the most famous acts of calm in a night of panic. In the middle of chaos, music continued until the sea took the instruments from their hands. Not every story from that night is about fear. Isidore and Ida Strauss, an elderly couple from first class, refused to separate. When officers urged Ida into a lifeboat, she stepped back and told her husband she would not leave him. They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the water rose. Elsewhere, a young mother placed her children into a boat and stayed behind, because there was no more room. A father lifted his sons over the rail, and then stepped away so others could board. These quiet choices stand beside the louder moments of the disaster, and remind us that courage often looks ordinary until the moment it is tested. The SS Californian sat roughly 10 to 20 miles away. Her crew saw rockets in the night sky. They discussed them. Some thought they might be company signals or celebrations. The wireless operator had already gone to bed, after being told to stop interrupting earlier messages. No one woke the captain with real urgency until it was far too late. By the time the Californian finally moved, the Titanic was gone and the Carpathia was already collecting survivors. The question of what the Californian's officers truly understood that night remains one of the most bitter debates in the entire story. Deep in the ship's bunkers, a fire had been burning for days before the Titanic even left port. Crew members fought it by moving coal and trying to starve the flames of air. The heat was intense enough that some later claimed it damaged the steel of a bulkhead. Whether the fire played a major role in the sinking is still argued by experts. What is certain is that the fire was real. It was known, and the ship still sailed at full speed into ice-filled waters. With 14 years earlier, a novel called Futility told the story of a giant liner named the Titan. The ship was called Unsinkable. It struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic in April. There were not enough lifeboats. Most of the people on board died in the freezing water. The similarities are so precise that readers still feel a chill when they compare the two. The author, Morgan Robertson, always said he had simply written a story based on the technology and attitudes of his time. Coincidence or warning, the book remains one of the strangest footnotes in Titanic history. The lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars on the night of the collision. The key to the locker that held them had been left behind in Southampton when a crew member was transferred at the last minute. Without the glasses, the men on watch relied only on their eyes in the dark. When the iceberg finally appeared, it was already too close for a full turn. A simple missing key became part of a chain of small failures that ended in catastrophe. When the ship broke apart, the bow section plunged almost immediately. The stern rose high into the air, hung for a moment, then slid under. Inside the hull, lights stayed on longer than many expected, casting a ghostly glow over the chaos. In the water, the cold was merciless. Most people who entered the sea without a lifeboat died within minutes. The few who survived long enough to be pulled into boats carried memories of screaming that slowly faded into silence. The ocean took more than 1,500 lives that night and kept most of their stories forever. When the wreck was found in 1985, it confirmed many details and raised new questions. The ship lies in two main pieces on the ocean floor, surrounded by a debris field of personal belongings, shoes, and pieces of the grand staircase. Divers and cameras have shown the damage from the iceberg, the broken hull, and the quiet graveyard that remains. Yet the wreck cannot answer every human mystery. Why certain decisions were made, what people felt in their final minutes, or how many small chances for survival were missed. The steel still rests in darkness, holding secrets the water will never fully give back. More than a century later, the Titanic still grips the imagination. It is not only because of the size of the ship or the number of deaths. It is because the disaster feels like a perfect storm of human confidence, ignored warnings, strange coincidences, and ordinary people facing the end with both fear and courage. Every new generation rediscovers the story and finds something different in it. The Titanic was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it became a permanent reminder that nature does not care about the words unsinkable, and that history's strangest chapters are often written in the dark, far from shore, when no one is watching closely enough. Hidden problem below decks. The public only learned the details long after the disaster.